This presentation assumes you've already watched The Path to Type 2 Diabetes and understand that type 2 diabetes is the combination of insulin resistance and insulin underproduction. Please take the time to watch that presentation, The Path to Type 2 Diabetes. It only takes 10 minutes to watch. Have you ever wondered why diabetes can have so many consequences? Why one condition, usually just thought of as too much glucose in the blood, can influence the health of your eyes, your kidneys, liver, heart and blood vessels, brain and nervous system? Why, along with diabetes medications such as metformin, many people with type 2 diabetes are also taking medication to control blood pressure, cholesterol, and even mood? I hope you've wondered these things, because that curiosity is exactly what you need to best manage and hopefully reverse your diabetes in the long run. This presentation will simplify the complex relationship between insulin resistance and health, so you can start to see how things fit together. The follow-on presentations will address what drives insulin resistance and what you can do about it. If you think back to the end of the previous presentation, you'll remember that what should happen as blood glucose goes up is insulin should go up. Then as insulin does its job of directing glucose into various organs and tissues, blood glucose should go down. And then blood insulin will go down in response. The rest of this presentation will look at this in a little bit more detail and also show you that insulin does a lot more than simply shuttle glucose into our cells. The first thing to recognize is that your body's sensitivity to insulin slides along a spectrum. At one end is very good sensitivity, meaning that the body responds both quickly and appropriately to insulin. At the other end is very poor insulin sensitivity, also called insulin resistance. In this state, the body responds slowly and at times inappropriately to insulin. When the body is insulin resistant, provided the pancreas is still up to it, more insulin is produced. Imagine the body as hard of hearing and the pancreas as someone speaking more loudly. It can work, but for some of the detail in the message can go missing. And eventually the person shouting gets hoarse while the person who's hard of hearing gets more deaf. And that's really what happens in type 2 diabetes. You may ask, but what is insulin? Insulin is a hormone. Hormones are substances in our blood that act as messengers from one part of our body to other parts. That's how our body can communicate and control itself as a single unit. Hormones help the billions of cells and many organs that make up our body coordinate with each other. The hormone insulin is produced by an organ called the pancreas. And what insulin does is help to direct where energy in the form of glucose, fat, and even protein goes in the body. Insulin helps to direct how energy is used and stored. It's not uncommon for people, even doctors, to focus on only one function of insulin, but insulin has many important functions, and it will help you to know a little bit about these to better control your type 2 diabetes, or even reverse it. Insulin has a hand in too many processes to cover, and no doubt we'll discover more in the future as more and more research is done. Here, we're only going to focus on the most relevant and interesting ones. Most probably, all parts of our body that respond to insulin can become resistant to its signals. Many organs get multiple instructions from insulin, and sometimes those organs will be resistant to some signals from insulin, but not to others. Think of it in terms of a hearing test. When you go, they don't just test how loud a sound has to be before you can hear it. They also test what frequencies you can hear. Insulin is like a range of sounds with different frequencies. Some might get through, while others don't. And that's a useful piece of information to have, because it makes it easier to understand why things can go wrong. If it was just a case of turning up the volume, or in this case producing or taking more insulin, then we really wouldn't have much of a problem. But it's a little bit more, probably a lot more, complicated than that. We're going to try and make it simple. Insulin is carried around our bodies via the bloodstream. Our blood vessels don't just passively carry insulin around though, they respond to insulin by relaxing, opening up, and letting blood through more easily. Depending on what else is going on, what other signals they're receiving, this helps lower our blood pressure. Also, under conditions of good insulin sensitivity, blood vessels grow in a more healthy way and are less likely to get inflamed. On the other hand, in insulin resistance, blood vessels tend to narrow. They don't literally close, but they do let less blood through, which can increase blood pressure. The walls around the blood vessels are also more likely to thicken, and inflammation occurs more easily with insulin resistance. This is all bad news because when you throw in some fatty buildup on those same blood vessel walls, you have the makings of a clot that can result as a stroke or a heart attack. Lastly, consider that to get to your organs, insulin has to get through your blood vessel walls. And that isn't going to happen very easily when your blood vessels are themselves insulin resistant. It's a bit like sound having to get through your earwax. The more of it you have, the less sound is likely to get through. Let's move on to the heart. It pumps all the blood around our bodies. As blood glucose and insulin go up, the heart absorbs more glucose from the blood and shifts from using mainly fat to using mainly glucose for energy. Insulin also encourages the heart to take up fat from the blood and store it for later. With insulin resistance, these signals either don't get through or are interpreted differently. The result is that the heart takes up and uses less glucose, and it takes up and uses more fat. Unfortunately, it uses less fat than it actually takes up, so over time it actually becomes fatty. Insulin sensitivity is also important for normal brain structure and function, and that may explain why there's a link between diabetes, mood, and brain health. An insulin-sensitive brain will respond to this rise in insulin by feeling less hungry, and it will signal the liver to produce less glucose, and signal the body to burn more energy. After all, if insulin has gone up, then that's a sure sign that blood glucose has gone up. If there's all this fuel floating around, the body doesn't have to use it as sparingly, and it certainly doesn't have to pump more fuel from its stores into the bloodstream. On the other hand, when the brain is insulin resistant, we tend to keep feeling hungry even after we've actually had our fill. And that may be why people with insulin resistance often eat more in one go and or eat more frequently than they would otherwise if they were more insulin sensitive. Because insulin also interacts with our sense of reward, resistance to insulin is likely to dampen the positive feeling we get from having food. So we will need to have more of it, or have more stimulating food to get that same feeling that we would get with far less if we had good insulin sensitivity. A lot like taking certain drugs over time makes us more and more resistant to their effects, so we need to have more and more. That, of course, is bad news if you're trying to eat less and reduce your weight and actually improve the problem of insulin resistance. Next are our fat storing cells, or adipocytes. When fat cells respond correctly to insulin, they take glucose out of the blood and store it, mainly by converting it to fat. They also hold onto their fat stores and stop releasing fat into the blood. After all, insulin is the signal that there's plenty of fuel in the form of glucose already in the blood. It doesn't make sense to pump more in. This all helps to control both how much glucose and how much fat is floating around in the body. When fat cells get insulin resistant, they stop removing glucose from blood as well, even when that blood glucose is quite high. And they keep releasing fat into the blood because that signal that there's plenty of fuel just isn't getting through. So now there is an excess of glucose and an excess of fat in the blood. Moving on to muscles, which is often the focus of explanations of type 2 diabetes. When muscles are sensitive to insulin, they respond to an increase in insulin by taking glucose out of the blood and switching from using mainly fat to mainly glucose as the form of energy. That means stores of fat in the muscle cells are maintained while the muscle is using glucose as its fuel. If the muscle is currently active, you're doing exercise or otherwise active, then more of the glucose will be used for energy, and if the muscle isn't active at the time, then the glucose will be stored for later. On the other hand, things work a little bit differently in insulin resistance. Let's clarify a common misconception though. Muscles don't need insulin in order to be able to absorb glucose. Muscle contraction, so using muscle, such as when exercising, increases glucose absorption independent of insulin. And that's what makes exercise such a good way of helping to control blood glucose. Using up fuel in the muscle, either fat or glucose stored in the muscle, also helps. The muscle gets hungry and therefore absorbs more glucose from the bloodstream. Still, insulin will help get glucose into the muscle, especially if that muscle isn't currently being used and already has quite high stores of fat. So insulin resistance in the muscle, which is the biggest organ system we have for storing glucose, is very important in terms of improving blood glucose control. The liver is also key. In many ways, it's the number one organ for controlling glucose after pancreas, which after all produces the insulin. Liver helps control blood glucose. It's the only organ designed to both store or release glucose as and when needed. The liver is also the organ that can convert components of fat and protein into glucose. The liver is the machine, but hormones, especially insulin, are the operators that tell it what to do at any given point in time. Under normal conditions, increased blood insulin signals the liver to take up more glucose out of the blood than it puts in, thereby helping to keep blood glucose concentration within the narrow healthy range. Insulin actually encourages the liver to convert glucose into fat. That's just a better storage form for energy in the long run. But the reason the slide that you're looking at has a stop sign next to this process is that when the liver and other organs are insulin sensitive, when they respond appropriately to insulin, then blood insulin is only ever high for brief periods. It goes up and it gets the job done. As a result of blood insulin only being high briefly, not much of this converting glucose to fat actually happens. In good insulin sensitivity, the liver doesn't convert an appreciable amount of glucose to fat. And that's a good thing, and we'll see why. Why is that, on the other hand, when the liver is insulin resistant, it keeps putting more glucose into your bloodstream despite raised insulin. This also means that both the food you eat and your liver are directly boosting your blood glucose. You can see how it can get very easily out of control. If you are insulin resistant, then insulin stays high for a long time after a meal. And that means that the liver keeps getting the signal to convert glucose to fat. This is one of those specific signals that gets through despite the insulin resistance. So instead of only converting glucose to fat in small amounts for brief periods close to meal times, as would happen if someone is sensitive to insulin, the liver in someone who's insulin resistant converts glucose to fat 24/7. It's an around-the-clock process. And that causes fat to build up in the liver, making it fatty, which in and of itself drives insulin resistance. So in summary, in widespread insulin resistance, we get a lot of glucose in the blood from food and from the liver, and also a lot of fat in the blood, mainly from our fat cells. The extra fat can end up in the organs where it doesn't belong, like back in the liver, building up in the heart, building up in the pancreas, and even making our muscles fatty. The fat can also end up in blood vessel walls. The excess fat in the liver increases insulin resistance. The excess fat in the heart changes how it uses energy and how well it works. And excess fat in the pancreas is likely to reduce how well it can produce insulin and also how well it works overall, because the pancreas doesn't just produce insulin. It does other things, and they can all be impaired when it starts getting fatty. So blood glucose, although necessary in controlled amounts, when blood glucose goes too low, it's very bad news. But when it is often high, it begins to damage everything from blood vessels to nerves. A healthy metabolism requires good insulin sensitivity. When insulin sensitivity is good, then the concentrations of insulin remain low most of the time. Blood glucose and blood levels of fat also remain at the healthy end of low. The body becomes good at storing glucose in the liver and muscle, which is what it's designed for, without converting large amounts of it to fat. And the body stays better at using the available fat as fuel if and when needed. That's why in parts 2 and 3 of the series, we look at what drives insulin resistance and what you can do to help improve your insulin sensitivity. When you're ready, please watch part 2.